Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease. It is a neurodegenerative disease. Neurodegenerative disease characterized by triad يعني three features اللي هي tremor, bradykinesia. برادي معناها slow كاينيزيا معناها movement. فبراديكاينيزيا معناها slowness of movement. And there is rigidity يعني spasm of muscles. It is a chronic progressive disorder. إذن إحنا عندنا multiple sclerosis chronic progressive Alzheimer's disease chronic progressive and Parkinson's disease is a chronic progressive. Person come with expressionless faces يعني كأنما لابس ماسك. وجهه خالي من التعابير. Stooping posture, there is abnormal posture. There is difficulty in maintaining balance يعني الشخص يفقد التوازن. There is bradykinesia اللي هي slow movement together with tremor and rigidity. Tremor هو abnormal shaking movements of hands. And rigidity هو increased spasticity. إذا نتحدث عن الابيديميولوجي of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a common cause of movement disorder. It affects about 20% of population. It's usually seen in elderly. The onset typically occur in the 5th to 8th decades. في العقد الخامس إلى الثامن تبدي البرزنتيشن. The majority of cases, most cases are sporadic. Sometimes there's an autosomal dominant or familial Parkinson's disease. شنو الكوز of Parkinson's disease؟ بالمناسبة يعني احنا عندنا مصطلحين هو الباركنسون ديزيز and Parkinsonism. Parkinsonism هو clinical entity characterized by these clinical features اللي تحدثنا عنها اللي هي عبارة عن tremor, rigidity, bradykinesia. بينما الباركنسون ديزيز هو an idiopathic nature of Parkinsonism اللي نسميه paralysis igitans. It is the most common cause of Parkinson's disease. It is idiopathic. ليش الكوز؟ ما معروف. There may be post-encephalitis Parkinsonism. Post-encephalitis. طبعا هذه post-encephalitis Parkinson's disease is rare. ليش rare؟ طلاب اكو واحد يقدر يقول لي ليش rare البوست-encephalitic Parkinsonism؟ وياي على الخط طلاب تسمعوني؟ سؤالي واضح. ليش rare البوست encephalitic Parkinsonism؟ No answer. طلاب الجواب واضح منطقي. حاول يعني طلاب دائما الكومن سنس كومن سنس مهم. الكومن سنس مهم. الانسفيلايتس هسه كومن. الانسفيلايتس از رير. منطقيا كل شيء يتبع الانسفيلايتس رير ايفنت از رير. بما انه الانسفيلايتس فد شيء نادر منطقيا الباركنسون ديزيز due to encephalitis اكيد نادر. There may be ischemia. Another cause of Parkinson's disease is ischemia. إذن هو post infection maybe idiopathic ischemia. اذا طلاب خلي نحاول هسه واحنا ننطي المحاضره، خلينا نحاول نخلي فد نيمونيك حتى نقدر نحفظ. there's idiopathic البوست انسفاليتيك خلينا نسميها بوست انفكشن. ويا طلاب تسمعوني طلاب؟
نعم دكتور.
اذا idiopathic تبدي بحرف الاي، انفكشن تبدي بحرف الاي، زين اسكيمي ايضا تبدي بحرف الاي حتى نحفظها بعد لا ننساها. زين العفو، سوري. زين drugs such as phenothiazine and haloperidol. زين الدراجز ما نقدر نقول ياتروجينيك، مو صحيح؟ نقدر نقول لا لا ياتروجينيك يعني بسبب الطبيب، هو من ينطي دراج مو طبيب. اذا ياتروجينيك ايضا تبدي بحرف الاي. زين idiopathic infection ischemia iatrogenic توكسين. طلع بالتوكسين ما نقدر نقول intoxication بين هذه تبدي بحرف الاي. هيد تروما repetitive هيد تروما، ليش ما نقول انجري؟ مو صحيح هيد انجري تبدي بحرف الاي. اذا idiopathic infection post infection ischemia iatrogenic intoxication injury. هاي الانجري نشوفها هيد انجري، نشوفها بالبوكسرز. بوكسرز اللي هم الملاكمين. سامعين محمد علي كلاي؟ محمد علي كلاي هذا كان ملاكم مشهور واصيب بالباركنسون ديزيز. يعني حذروا الاطباء ايرلي انه يترك الملاكمه، لكن ما تركها، وفي نهايه حياته صار عنده باركنسونيزم due to repeated head injury. اوكي اذا خلينا نشوف ليش اكو باركنسون ديزيز، ليش يصير باركنسون ديزيز. There is loss of energetic neurons in the pigmented nuclei of the brainstem and disruption of the normal function of nigrostriatal pathway. The neurons of substantia nigra project to the corpus striatum يعني to the globus pallidus and putamen where they release neurotransmitter اللي نسميه دوبامين. Substantia nigra produce dopamine. There is degeneration، احنا مو سميناها neurodegenerative disease. There is degeneration of neurons of substantia nigra. إذا degeneration of and atrophy شنو النتيجة المتوقعة؟ يعني neurons of substantia nigra produce dopamine. من يصير بها atrophy معناها there is reduction in the amount of dopamine, loss of dopamine. Another neurotransmitter which have balance with dopamine, with the action of dopamine اللي هو الاسيتايلكولين. من يصير reduction in dopamine معناها there is compensatory inhibition. dopamine هو inhibitory، فلما there is loss of inhibitory effect of dopamine منو اللي راح يطغى المفعول مالته؟ الاسيتايلكولين. لما يصير reduction in inhibition due to dopamine معناها the prominent effect will be there is accentuation, relative accentuation، يعني ما يزيد الاسيتايلكولين، لا الايفكت ما راح يصير به inhibition due to loss of dopamine. هذا loss of dopamine with accentuation of the effect of acetylcholine will lead to disequilibrium, loss of control of movement. Loss of control of movement. The clinical manifestation is caused by selective and progressive destruction of pigmented neurons in substantia nigra. بهالحالة معناها there is loss of neuroregulation of motor function. ليش هسه قلنا من يصير loss of dopaminergic neurons يقل الدوبامين اللي هو inhibitory راح يصير prominency of the effect of acetylcholine. هذا الامبالانس بين الدوبامين effect والacetylcholine produce loss of control of muscles, skeletal muscles. النيورونز المتبقية تحتوي على residual material نسميها لوي بوديز. إذا أسألك بالامتحان على اللوي بوديز define لوي بوديز أو mention the most prominent features in the morphology of Parkinson's disease. راح تقول لي loss of dopaminergic neurons, there is loss of depigmentation of substantia nigra. طلع من اسمها substantia nigra. substantia يعني substance, nigra معناها black. ليش صارت black؟ لأنه precursors of dopamine لونها black. نيوروميلانين يكون لونه dark brown to black. When there is loss of dopamine, source of dopamine, راح يصير depigmentation. And there is formation of the residual aggregate اللي سميناها Lewy bodies. وممكن أسألك بطريقة أخرى أقول لك Lewy bodies are characteristic of or is a feature of number 1 multiple sclerosis, number 2 Alzheimer's disease, number 3 Parkinson's disease. ممكن أخلي لك بعد فيتشر أخرى أو ديزيز آخر حتى تتذكرها أو أسألك بها بالامتحان. Grossly there is pale substantia nigra and locus ceruleus. Microscopically there is loss of pigmented من اسمه. pale يعني لا تقرأ بمعزل. الجروس والميكروسكوبيك هي الميكروسكوب هو الشادو وظل الجروس. فبما انه there is pale substantia nigra ليش؟ لانه there is loss of pigmented neurons that produce dopamine. ومن يصير loss of neurons شو راح يصير repair؟ ما راح يصير repair by fibrosis بالCNS, by gliosis. There is reactive proliferation of glial cells اللي يسمى gliosis. إذا عندنا two microscopic features مهمة بالباركنسونز disease: loss of dopaminergic neurons and production of Lewy bodies اللي هي عبارة عن eosinophilic cytoplasmic inclusions in the neurons of substantia nigra. لاحظوا هذه الصورة، هذه هنا، هذه نورمال. لاحظوا هذه المنطقة ديب براون تو بلاك، وهنا صايرة بيل. ليش صارت بيل؟ due to loss of dopaminergic neurons. هذه عبارة عن Parkinson's disease وهذا النورمال. يعني بي اللي على رايت سايد هي نورمال. لاحظوا هنا البيجمنتد اريا، هنا الديبيجمنتد اريا due to loss of neurons. وارجع واكد طلاب هذه الصور مطلوبه من عندكم بالامتحان العملي مو بالمحاضره النظري. راح ارفعها لكم هذه الباوربوينت وتحتفظون بها. clinically شلون يجينا البيشنت with Parkinson's disease؟ there is slowness of all voluntary movements. There is bradykinesia, there is a slow voluntary movement. والترمر هذه الشيكينج اكيد شايفين الناس عندهم رعشه، مو صحيح؟ عندهم شيكينج هاندز، مو صحيح؟ اكيد انكم شايفين هواي ناس elderly بهالشكل. هذا هو الترمر. وقلنا الفيس مالته عبالك لابس ماسك expressionless face. There is increased spasticity, spasm, muscle spasm, here rigidity. Again, there is increased chance of dementia. The mechanism, يعني ليش يصير dementia in patient with Parkinson's disease حقيقة yet to be elucidated. يعني not known. شنو exact mechanism, exact cause of dementia in Parkinson's disease is not known. بعد ما شفنا هذه الصورة الجروس وقارنا بين هذه الاريا بيجمنتد وهنا دي بيجمنتد، خلينا نشوف هذا الصورة الميكروسكوبيك. هذه الاريا اللي مخلين عليها رمز حرف L، هذه عبارة عن Lewy bodies in the surviving neuron. هذه نيورون affected by or showing Lewy bodies. This is Lewy bodies. وأكيد أكيد إنه هذه الصور مطلوبة من عندكم بالعملي مو بس بالنظري. There is what is called Lewy bodies in a neuron from a patient died of Parkinson's disease. And let's summarize the features of Parkinson's disease. It is a neurodegenerative disorder characterized by tremor, bradykinesia, slowness of movements, and rigidity or spasticity. The cause of Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonism may be idiopathic, maybe due to injury or ischemia or infection or intoxication by drugs or iatrogenic. Pathogenesis due to loss of the inhibitory effect of dopamine neurotransmitter, imbalance with prominence of the acetylcholine effect, leading to abnormal control of movements. خلي نشوف بعض المقاطع الفيديو اللي توضح لنا المحاضرة مالتنا هذا اليوم. طلاب الكل شايفين الفيديو؟ طلاب ظاهر
Multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating disease of the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. It is the protective sheath that surrounds the axon of neurons, allowing them to quickly send electrical impulses. This myelin is produced by oligodendrocytes, which are a group of cells that support neurons. In multiple sclerosis, demyelination happens when the immune system inappropriately attacks and destroys the myelin, which makes communications between neurons break down, ultimately leading to all sorts of sensory, motor, and cognitive problems. Now, the brain, including the neurons in the brain, is protected from things in the blood by the blood-brain barrier, which only lets certain molecules and cells through from the blood. For immune cells like T and B cells, that means they have to have the right ligand or surface molecule to get through the blood-brain barrier. This is kind of like having a VIP pass to get into an exclusive club. Once a T cell makes its way in, it can get activated by something it encounters. In the case of multiple sclerosis, it's activated by myelin. Once the T cell gets activated, it changes the blood-brain barrier cells to express more receptors, and this allows immune cells to more easily bind and get in. It's kind of like bribing the bouncer to let in a lot of people. Now, multiple sclerosis is a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction, or a cell-mediated hypersensitivity. And this means that those myelin-specific T cells release cytokines like interleukin-1, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interferon gamma, which together dilate the blood vessels, which allows more immune cells to get in, as well as directly cause damage to the oligodendrocytes. These cytokines also attract B cells and macrophages as part of the inflammatory reaction. Those B cells start to make antibodies that mark the myelin sheath proteins. And then the macrophages use those antibody markers to engulf and destroy the oligodendrocytes. Without oligodendrocytes, there's no myelin to cover the neurons. And this leaves behind areas of scar tissue, also called plaques or sclera. In multiple sclerosis, these immune attacks typically happen in bouts. In other words, an autoimmune attack on the oligodendrocytes might happen, and then regulatory T cells will come in to inhibit or calm down the other immune cells, leading to a reduction in the inflammation. Early on in multiple sclerosis, the oligodendrocytes will heal and extend out new myelin to cover the neurons, which is a process called remyelination. Unfortunately, though, over time, as the oligodendrocytes die off, the remyelination stops, and the damage becomes irreversible with the loss of axons. Just like other autoimmune diseases, the exact cause of multiple sclerosis is unknown, but it's linked to both genetic and environmental factors. Genetic risk factors include being female and having genes that encode a specific type of immune molecule called HLA-DR2, which is used to identify and bind to foreign molecules. Environmental risk factors might include infections as well as D deficiency, which is an interesting one because it might help explain why the rates of multiple sclerosis are higher at the northern and southern poles compared to the equator, where there's a lot more sunlight. Together, these genetic and environmental influences might lead to the body not killing off immune cells that target myelin. So it turns out that there are actually 4 main types of multiple sclerosis, based on the pattern of symptoms over time. To break this down, we can use a graph with time on the x-axis, where time refers to the lifespan of the individual, and disability on the y-axis. The first and by far the most common pattern of multiple sclerosis is called relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, or RRMS. This condition is what we just described, bouts of autoimmune attacks happening months or even years apart, and causing an increase in the level of disability. For example, during a bout, a person might lose some vision, but then it might be followed by improvement if there's remyelination. Unfortunately, though, more often than not, the remyelination process isn't complete, so there's often some residual disability that remains. That means that with each attack, more and more of the central nervous system gets irreversibly damaged. In the relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis type, there's typically no increase in disability between bouts, so the line stays flat during that time. Now, the second type is called secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, or SPMS, which initially is pretty similar to the relapsing remitting type. But over time, the immune attack's constant, which causes a steady progression of disability. The third type is primary progressive multiple sclerosis, or PPMS, which is basically one constant attack on myelin, which causes a steady progression of disability over a person's lifetime. The final type is progressive relapsing multiple sclerosis, or PRMS, which is also one constant attack, but this time there are bouts superimposed, which means the disability happens even faster. Specific symptoms vary a lot from person to person, and largely depend on the location of the plaques, and multiple sclerosis typically affects individuals between the ages of 10 and 40. Symptoms related to bouts can typically worsen over weeks and can linger for months without treatment. One common trio of multiple sclerosis symptoms is called Charcot's neurologic triad, and it includes dysarthria, which is difficult or unclear speech, nystagmus, which is involuntary rapid eye movements, and an intention tremor. Dysarthria is due to plaques in the brainstem that affects nerve fibers that control muscles of the mouth and throat. And this can interfere with conscious movements like eating and talking, and could lead to things like a new stutter, as well as unconscious movements like swallowing. Nystagmus is due to plaques around the nerves controlling eye movements. Plaques around the optic nerve causes loss of vision in one or both of the eyes because of damage to the optic nerve, which is called optic neuritis. Sometimes there's blurring or graying of the vision, or alternatively, there might be a dark point in the center of vision. Additionally, if there's damage to the nerves controlling eye movement, then eye movements can be painful and there can even be double vision if the eyes no longer move in a coordinated way. Finally, intention tremors can be caused by plaques along the motor pathways in the spinal cord, which can affect outbound signals like skeletal muscle control. Motor symptoms can include muscle weakness, muscle spasms, tremors, and ataxia, which is a loss of balance and coordination. In serious cases, this can lead to paralysis. In addition, plaques in the sensory pathways can affect inbound signals, like sensations from the skin, which causes symptoms like numbness, pins and needles, and paresthesias, which are often a tingling feeling, but might also be a painful itching or burning sensation. Occasionally, there can be very specific sensory symptoms, like Larameet sign, which is when an electric shock runs down the back and radiates to the limbs when a person bends their neck forward. Plaques can also involve the autonomic nervous system, which can lead to bowel and bladder symptoms like constipation and urinary incontinence, as well as sexual symptoms like sexual dysfunction. Finally, multiple sclerosis can also affect higher order activities of the brain, causing poor concentration and critical thinking, as well as depression and anxiety. Multiple sclerosis is typically suspected when there are multiple neurologic symptoms separated in space, which is attributable to damage in different locations in the nervous system, as well as time, meaning separate bouts or flare-ups, as well as remission. The diagnosis of multiple sclerosis is supported by an MRI that shows multiple central nervous system lesions, called white matter plaques, since these regions tend to have a lot of myelin. Also, in the cerebrospinal fluid, there might be high levels of antibodies, which indicates an autoimmune process. Finally, a visual evoked potential can be helpful as well, which measures the nervous system's response to visual stimuli. For treatment, there's no cure for multiple sclerosis, but there are medications which are particularly effective for the relapsing remitting type because they lessen the severity of relapses and make them happen less frequently. Medications like corticosteroids, cyclophosphamide, which is a cell cycle inhibitor, and intravenous immunoglobulin can all be used to help blunt the autoimmune process. In addition, plasmapheresis can be effective as well, which is when the plasma is filtered to remove disease-causing autoantibodies. Chronic treatment for multiple sclerosis includes immunosuppressants like recombinant beta interferon, which decreases the level of inflammatory cytokines in the brain, as well as increases the function. There's also an increasing interest in the role of vitamin D as an effective treatment. All right, as a quick recap, multiple sclerosis is a chronic and progressive autoimmune disorder, and the most common pattern is the relapsing remitting type, where individuals have flares that come and go, with each one slightly worsening their overall condition. During a flare, T cells cause inflammation and damage to oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, which leaves behind scarred areas of demyelinated neurons called plaques, which causes a variety of symptoms depending on the location. Thanks for watching. You can help support us by donating on Patreon.
هلا بنشوف مقطع آخر. طلاب الكل شايفين الفيديو؟ تسمعوني بابا؟
نعم واضح واضح جدا.
Dementia isn't technically a disease, but more of a way to describe a set of symptoms like poor memory and difficulty learning new information, which can make it really hard to function independently. Usually, dementia is caused by some sort of damage to the cells in the brain, which can be caused by a variety of diseases. Alzheimer's disease, now referred to as Alzheimer's disease, is the most common cause of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is considered a neurodegenerative disease, meaning it causes the degeneration or loss of neurons in the brain, particularly in the cortex. This, as you might expect, leads to the symptoms characteristic of dementia. Although the cause of Alzheimer's disease isn't completely understood, two major players that are often cited in its progression are plaques and tangles. All right, so here we've got this cell membrane of a neuron in the brain. In the membrane, you've got this molecule called amyloid precursor protein, or APP. One end of this guy's in the cell, and the other end's outside the cell. It's thought that this guy helps the neuron grow and repair itself after an injury. Since APP is a protein, just like other proteins, it gets used and over time it gets broken down and recycled. Normally, it gets chopped up by an enzyme called alpha secretase and its buddy, gamma secretase. This chopped up peptide's soluble and goes away, and everything's all good. If another enzyme, beta secretase, teams up with gamma secretase instead, then we've got a problem. And this leftover fragment isn't soluble and creates a monomer called amyloid beta. These monomers tend to be chemically sticky and bond together just outside the neurons and form what are called beta amyloid plaques, these clumps of lots of these monomers. These plaques can potentially get between the neurons, which can get in the way of neuron-to-neuron signaling. If the brain cells can't signal and relay information, then brain functions like memory can be seriously impaired. It's also thought that these plaques can start up an immune response and cause inflammation, which might damage surrounding neurons. Amyloid plaque can also deposit around blood vessels in the brain, called amyloid angiopathy, which weakens the walls of the blood vessels and increases the risk of hemorrhage or rupture and blood loss. Here's an image of amyloid plaque on histology. These clumps are buildups of beta amyloid, and this is happening outside the cells. Another big part of Alzheimer's disease, though, are tangles, and these are actually found inside the cell, as opposed to the beta amyloid plaques. Just like other cells, neurons are held together by their cytoskeleton, which is partly made up of microtubules, these track-like structures that essentially act like a minecart, shipping nutrients and molecules along the length of the cell. A special protein called tau makes sure that these tracks don't break apart, kind of like railway ties. Although, again, it's not completely understood, it's thought that the beta amyloid plaque buildup outside the neuron initiates pathways inside the neuron that leads to activation of kinase, an enzyme that transfers phosphate groups to the tau protein. The tau protein then changes shape, stops supporting the microtubules, and clumps up with other tau proteins and gets tangled, and leads to the other characteristic finding of Alzheimer's disease, neurofibrillary tangles. Neurons with tangles in non-functioning microtubules can't signal as well, and sometimes end up undergoing apoptosis, or programmed cell death. Here's an image of histology showing these neurofibrillary tangles formed inside the neuron. As neurons die, large-scale changes start to take place in the brain. For one, the brain atrophies, or shrinks, and the gyri get narrower, which are the characteristic ridges of the brain. As those get narrower, the sulci, which are the grooves between the gyri, get wider. With atrophy, the ventricles, or fluid-filled cavities in the brain, get larger as well. So that's the pathophysiology part. But why does this happen in some people and not others? Well, Alzheimer's disease can be split into two groups, sporadic and familial. Sporadic's used to describe the late onset type, where the exact cause isn't very well defined, and is probably a combination of genetic and environmental risk factors. And sporadic accounts for the vast majority of cases. With sporadic Alzheimer's, the risk increases significantly with age, affecting around 1% of people between ages 60 and 65, and 50% of people over the age of 85. In fact, a gene that's been identified as possibly contributing to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease is the E4 allele of apolipoprotein E gene, or APOE E4. Researchers have shown that the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease increases for patients that inherit one E4 allele, and increases even more for patients who inherited two E4 alleles, one from each parent. Apolipoprotein E helps break down beta amyloid, but the E4 allele seems to be less effective than the other alleles, like the APOE E2 allele, meaning patients are more likely to develop beta amyloid plaques. Familial Alzheimer's disease, on the other hand, is used to describe cases where some dominant gene was inherited that speeds up the progression of the disease. So sometimes familial Alzheimer's disease is referred to as early onset Alzheimer's. Familial accounts for about 5 to 10% of cases and can be caused by several gene mutations. First, mutations in the PSEN1 or PSEN2 genes on chromosome 14 or chromosome 1, respectively, have been linked to early onset Alzheimer's. These genes encode for presenilin 1 and presenilin 2, both protein subunits of gamma secretase. Mutations in these PSEN1 or PSEN2 genes can change the location where gamma secretase chops APP, producing different length beta amyloid molecules, which seem to be better at clumping up and forming plaques. Another known genetic cause of Alzheimer's is trisomy 21, or Down syndrome, which involves an extra copy of chromosome 21. It turns out that the gene responsible for producing APP is located on chromosome 21, which means that people with Down syndrome have an extra APP gene, and presumably increased expression of APP, potentially increasing the amount of amyloid plaque buildup. For this reason, familial Alzheimer's disease often progresses by age 40 in patients with Down syndrome. Symptoms of Alzheimer's disease worsens as plaques and tangles build up and damage to the neurons accumulates. In the early stages, symptoms might not even be detectable. As it progresses, though, patients lose short-term memory. Like, for example, they might not be able to remember what they had for breakfast that morning. They then progress to loss of motor skills, making things like eating difficult without help. Also, language becomes affected, making it more difficult to communicate. Eventually, they lose long-term memory, like forgetting the name of their spouse or even that they're married in the first place. And they progressively become more disoriented, which can be dangerous because they might wander from home and get lost. In the late stages, they become bedridden, and the most common cause of death is actually infection, like pneumonia. Diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is really tough because the only way to definitively show that a person had Alzheimer's is by performing a brain biopsy after autopsy. Usually, a clinician will therefore make a diagnosis after excluding other causes of dementia. Currently, there isn't any cure for Alzheimer's disease. Some medications exist, but the benefits are small, and there haven't been any medications that clearly and definitively halt the progression of Alzheimer's.
لا بس نشوف المقطع الأخير اللي يوضح لنا الباركنسون ديزيز وننهي السيشن مالتنا اليوم. طلاب الكل شايفين الفيديو؟ طلاب ظاهر لكم الفيديو؟
Parkinson's disease, which is sometimes called Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's, or PD, is a movement disorder where the dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra of the brain undergo degeneration. Parkinson's is one of the most common neurological disorders. It's a progressive, adult-onset disease, and it gets more common with age. Most of the time, there's no known cause, but in a few cases, there might be a genetic cause, like mutations in the PINK1, Parkin, or alpha-synuclein genes. And in rare cases, Parkinsonian symptoms might be caused by MPTP, a toxic impurity that can be found in the recreational drug MPPP, or methylprotein, which is a synthetic opioid. In other people, one or more risk factors, rather than a single outright cause, might contribute to Parkinson's. For example, pesticide exposure or DNA variants in genes like LRRK2. No matter what the cause is, Parkinson's derives from the death of dopamine-producing or dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. The name substantia nigra means black substance, since it's darker than other brain regions when you look at a slice of the brain on an autopsy. We usually refer to the substantia nigra as if it's a single location. There are actually two of these regions in the brain, one on each side of the midbrain. The substantia nigra is a part of the basal ganglia, a collection of brain regions that control movement through their connections with the motor cortex. In Parkinson's, these darkened areas of substantia nigra gradually disappear. Under a microscope, Lewy bodies, which are eosinophilic, round inclusions made of alpha-synuclein protein, are present in the affected substantia nigra neurons before they die. The function of alpha-synuclein is unknown, as well as the significance of Lewy bodies. And they're both found in other diseases, like Lewy body dementia and multiple system atrophy. The substantia nigra actually can be split into two subregions. First, there's the pars reticulata, which receives signals from another part of the basal ganglia called the striatum, which is the term for the caudate and putamen put together, and relays messages to the thalamus via neurons rich in the neurotransmitter GABA, also known as gamma-aminobutyric acid. Second, there's the pars compacta, and this is the part of the substantia nigra affected in Parkinson's. The pars compacta sends messages to the striatum via neurons rich in the neurotransmitter dopamine, forming the nigrostriatal pathway, which helps to stimulate the cerebral cortex and initiate movement. Therefore, when substantia nigra pars compacta neurons die, the individual might be in a hypokinetic or low movement state, which is commonly seen in Parkinson's. In addition to simply initiating movements, the substantia nigra helps to calibrate and fine-tune the way that movements happen, which leads to the clinical features of Parkinson's. First, there's tremor, which is an involuntary shakiness most noticeable in the hands, characteristically called a pill-rolling tremor, because it looks like someone's rolling a pill between their thumb and index finger. This is a resting tremor, meaning it's present at rest, diminishes with intentional movement. Next, there's rigidity, which refers to stiffness that can appear as cogwheel rigidity, which is when there are a series of catches or stalls as a person's arms or legs are passively moved by someone else. Rigidity is also responsible for the stooped posture and an almost expressionless face that some individuals with Parkinson's might have. Next up is bradykinesia, which is slow movement, hypokinesia, which is lessened movement, and akinesia, which is an absence of movement, and all three result from difficulty initiating movements. Examples of this are having the legs freeze up when trying to walk and also walking with a shuffling gait, or small steps. Finally, a late feature of the disease is postural instability, which causes problems with balance and can lead to falls. Despite these multiple effects on movement, Parkinson's disease does not produce weakness. This helps differentiate it from diseases that affect the motor cortex or corticospinal pathway. In addition, the resting tremor of Parkinson's disease helps to differentiate it from cerebellar diseases, which might result in an action or intention tremor, which is a tremor that's essentially the opposite of a resting tremor, where the tremor actually gets with movement. Also, both bradykinesia and postural instability help differentiate Parkinson's from essential tremor, of which an action tremor is also a hallmark feature. Non-motor brain functions can be affected in Parkinson's as well, leading to additional common symptoms including depression, dementia, sleep disturbances, and difficulty smelling. These are thought to come about because of dysfunction of dopaminergic signaling in other parts of the brain beyond the substantia nigra. For example, in the prefrontal cortex, leading to cognitive symptoms, and also possibly from issues with other neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. Fortunately, there are treatments that help with Parkinson's symptoms.
ثانك يو. طلاب، بالنسبه للمحاضرات، يعني لاحظتوا احنا بالفصول السابقه ريسبيراتوري سيستم ورينال سيستم ننزل الباوربوينت واحيانا وياها على شكل PDF واحيانا وياها محاضره بصيغه اخرى الPDF. طبعا الباوربوينت طلاب بسلايدات كثيره بين 40 الى بحدود 40 سلايد. هذه طباعتها بالنسبه لكم وكلرد عاده تكون ملونه وهي معده للعرض اكثر مما هي معده كمحاضره تراجع بها. فاذا نزلت ويا الباوربوينت، انا راح انزل الباوربوينت وانزل وياها محاضره بدون هذه الفورماتنج اللي معروف فور برزنتيشن. القصد منها ان تكون المحاضره يعني بحدود 5 صفحات، المعلومات مكثفه، هي نفس المعلومات اللي موجوده بالباوربوينت وياها ديتيلز اخرى، لانه بالباوربوينت انا ما ممكن اعرض كل الكلام اعرضه لك على السلايد، والقراءه مالته راح تكون صعبه لانه معروف انه الخط 28 واكبر راح يكون واضح بالنسبه لكم، ولما يكون الفونت سايز بلو 28 راح يكون القراءه مالته صعبه. لذلك اللي ارجوه بالنسبه لكم انه لما انزل المحاضره على شكل ملف PDF بها ديتيلز وانزل الباوربوينت لا يصير اوفرلاب بالنسبه لكم، هي نفس المعلومات موجوده هنا بصيغه الباوربوينت for ease of presentation and the other mode of presentation for memorization and reading. أكد طلاب أنه جميع محاضراتي تعتمد على الفهم أكثر مما تعتمد على الدرخ، لذلك بالامتحان حاول أثناء ما تقرأ اسأل نفسك. Please use the process of questioning، يعني ويا ما تقرأ لا تدرخها كما هي، وإنما حاول أن تسأل نفسك أنه ليش هذا التوبيك صار. دائما استعمل كلمة why and what happens. زين، ومثل ما طلبت منكم اليوم ان يكون عندك ضروري يكون عندك قاموس طبي اللي هو انجليزي افضل، لانه يعطيك بريف ديفينيشن اباوت ايتش تيرم. يعني هواي مصطلحات هسه مرت عليكم، اذا نوقف عند كل واحد منها لانه انت اما ماخذه بالهيستولوجي بالاناتومي بالفسيولوجي فراح تشتت المحاضره. لذلك انا بعض التيرمز امر عليها سريعا، قسم اوضحها وقسم تبقى just for definition. ومثل ما ذكرت لكم دورلاند ديكشنري والويبستر ميديكال ديكشنري فيري جود ديكشنريز. اذا تحاول تحصل نسخه ورقيه افضل مما تحصل النسخه الاونلاين، اذروايز اكو هواي لينكس موجوده ويب بيجز ممكن تنزل منها الكتب اللي تحتاجها. طلاب، بالنسبه لكم يعني شنو ريفرنسز اللي جاي تعتمد عليها في القراءه؟